Not sure I like the name critical. I see what you're trying to get at, and I totally agree with the importance of that notion.
Yeah, I don't love that name either. Actually, I was going all through, the thesaurus looking for names. To say, for example, yeah, substantial was an idea actually. I think because you're trying to suggest a lot of things. It's similar to the idea of soundness, in that it's both premise is true and the conclusion follows from the premise. So it's similar to the idea in logic of soundness, but it's different. So I don't want to use the term soundness.
No, certainly not. It's quite different, actually. It's substantially contributing to the belief is what you're trying to say.
So I think even in an earlier draft, I used the word substantial, and then the metric was substance. So the substance of the argument is.
Yeah. Could we just call
I'm
it?
Not at all.
Yeah. Contributing?
I'm not wed to the contribution. Yeah. Yeah, definitely open to different terms, especially for that one.
Yeah. No, because the other ones are pretty good. The thing, what I'm realizing, sorry, it's a side issue about the term of critical and criticality versus persuasiveness.
Well, that's the kind of thing I guess we'd be talking about anyway, right? It's not really a side issue. Yeah.
We were thinking of different words for critical. That term, there's definitely other terms we might use that convey the same idea. Or suggested substance or substantial.
Substantial and not substance. See, I'm realizing something about persuasive versus what you call critical, is that it's actually context dependent in the sense that if an argument is alone to be persuasive, it's critical. It stops being critical when other persuasive arguments exist. It's the existence of other arguments that make it critical or not critical.
Yeah, and I think that this probably comes out in the Bayesian math. I haven't, I tried to read, I haven't done math in a long time like that, so I didn't work through it all. But I think we're just starting kind of randomly here, the discussion, but a lot of what I want to talk about is compare it to what I had imagined or written in the original white paper and things I've done in scoring and a lot of the parallels there. I didn't know about Bayesian. What do you call it? No, it's not Bayesian.
There's the Bayesian view of probability.
Probability
represents subjective belief,
right?
And that opposes, for example, to that's
frequentist.
Frequentist is sort of the other possible way of looking at probability. And then there's this idea of a Bayesian rational agent, which is now ubiquitous in the economics literature and the game theory literature and psychology, where you model people as a sort of perfect.
It's essentially an AI, and it's what I guess what a lot of people in the argumentation theory have been doing from the other side, which is writing AI and coming up with rules for calculating the math of whether or not. In other words, it's a mathematical, logical way of treating a decision maker or a viewer of a debate or something. Yeah.
Right. And so it's very prescriptive in that people, if they're not making inferences according to these rules of the rules of Bayesian inference, they're making a mistake. That's the general idea. Now, the reality is people don't always, they're not perfect Bayesians. Like all models, it's very, very approximate. Especially one thing about people is there's things like we have heuristics because to save effort of doing the correct computation. And so there's big deviations between the way people reason in a perfect Bayesian, but still you can kind of show mathematically that the results are more accurate if you use the proper rules of Bayesian inference.
I think, of course, there's a whole prescriptive versus descriptive, and how do people actually think, and it's absolutely important. But I think for me, the real reason why, on the one hand, I don't believe this has anything to do with how people think, and still it's important to write it down, because it's a way to tell people, okay, this is obviously not what you're doing. What are you doing? What else are you doing? And asking them, and making them be explicit about their reasons, and make them realize, okay, this is, often people will say they believe something for a given reason, and when they stop and think about it, that's not really the reason they believe it. Yes. And making those things explicit is useful that way. But yeah, we have to be very careful about not believing people think that way, and not telling people you should believe that way, because that's not helpful.
Yeah.
So yeah, but getting back to what you were saying about criticality being kind of context dependent, right? This also matches kind of the math I was working into scoring, which is sort of the intuition that, if there's an argument that convinces you so much, you're like 90% of the way convinced, right? And then there's a second argument that is just as strong and convinces you 90% of the way. They're not going to add up to I'm 180% certain, right? There's kind of a asymptotic nature to how much closer you can get to fully accepting the premise. And so whichever one you remove. So in other words, maybe the movement and the criticality needs to be something based on, a percentage of the remainder that was left to get you there, essentially.
If you think of them as independent variables, you can use probability laws to say, this makes it 90% and this makes it 90%. So together it will be, treat them as an independent variable, and P of A or B, and you'll get.
Yeah, although if you assume independence for variables that are actually not independent, you can actually get things like probabilities over 100%. Well, wait, that's not true.
No.
But you can get things that
are definitely
don't make
wrong.
Sense. Right.
Yes,
yeah.
that is true. That is true. You can get things wrong, but what I'm saying is, it's
no, actually, it is true. So, like a Bayesian classifier assumes independence of all the features, and that'll sometimes give you probabilities of greater than 1.
Is that so?
Because what you do is you
sounds wrong.
You keep on multiplying your prior by a factor that can be less or greater than 1. And if all the factors are greater than 1, then you can eventually get probability greater than 1.
I just don't believe that.
And I may be mistaken, but if you like, I think I remember working that out once. I could probably show you my conclusions. And it's a nonsense conclusion because your assumptions are nonsense. The assumptions of independence.
No, I think it's more than that. I think it's a misapplication of the rules somewhere. It has to be a proper application of independence rules. You cannot go over 1. I'm sure, even Bayesian probabilities. I'm pretty sure of that. One thing that I'm a bit curious about, you're okay, many things.
So I think just to make the best of use of our time, I know, Tim, you had specific things you want to talk about related to CDL. So I wanted to make sure that we get to those.
I think we will, but maybe to structure this a little better, if you could just give a little bit of background of, what you were doing when you wrote this, what you are doing in general, and where you're going with this article.
Yes, what's the goal?
Yeah, so this article, and there's another article I wrote about an argument model, just defining terms, premise, conclusion, warrant, and um, and some other important concepts related is, first of all, to that article on distributed Bayesian reasoning, which is basically a scoring, a way of scoring arguments. And the premise is that we're trying to estimate the probability that the average user in the forum would believe in some conclusion, given that everyone shared the same information. So to give an example of where people don't share the same information, in my article about the deliberative poll, I have the example where people were deciding where to go to lunch, and 4 out of 5 people said, let's go to Dino's. Or no, like 5 out of 7. And then one person commented and said, Dino's is closed. But that comment was sort of buried, in online chat platforms. You see a little icon that says one comment, but you don't necessarily read the comment. And so you don't change your vote. Now, let's say 2 or 3 people do read that comment and they all change their vote because Dino's being closed is a good reason not to go there for lunch. Some people might disagree, but in this case, everyone agreed. And so the people that had that information were more likely to come to a different conclusion. And the idea is you can actually expand that out to very complex arguments. And you can use the rules of Bayesian inference to say, okay, the probability that someone would want to go to Dino's, given they'd seen this comment, is this, right? And you actually have to use Bayesian averaging because you have a small sample size. You have to take a lot of things into consideration. And if you have a more complex argument tree, it gets more complicated. And so I've kind of worked out that math. And why I call it distributed Bayesian reasoning is now you can actually have people, for example, that participated in this subtree of the argument, and other people, a completely different set of people that participated in some other subtree, and that information can propagate up and affect the conclusion. So it's a distributed reasoning process where not everybody has all the information, and yet that final conclusion, basically it's the hypothesis if you had what we call a meta-reasoner. And this is a person that had basically all the knowledge that everybody has and sort of aggregated, and where one person has holes in their knowledge, you fill it in with the knowledge other people have, and you can come up with this meta-reasoner that has these average beliefs, but then you have to kind of consolidate the inconsistencies. That, for example, this group thought we shouldn't go to Dino's, this people thought we should. What would a person that had all the information believe? And there's actually, I think, a pretty systematic way of doing that, rigorous way of doing that, and that's what I'm working on. And then another piece I'm working on, there's a group of 4 essays I've actually posted. The main one is called "Give Truth the Advantage," and it's just my overall vision for an algorithm that tends to promote what I call the honest and informed opinion. So it uses the peer prediction and other game theory results that have, there's a lot of work going on even recently on creating an equilibrium where people are honest even for subjective opinions, which is almost hard to believe. First time I read about that, I thought this can't possibly be true, but when you understand it, it makes sense. So you combine that with the distributed reasoning, and you basically identify things that are the honest and informed opinion, and promote those in social platforms in order to give truth an advantage.
So do I understand right that I've been reading a lot recently about techniques such as the change my mind, the deltas, and in a way, what you're doing in the first case is identifying the pieces of information that sway the people one way to the other. So it's about finding the highest delta. And you could, in a way, be much more simplified in mathematical apparatus by just saying, what are the pieces of information that have made the most people change their mind one way or the other?
Yep. I mean, that's kind of the main thing, right? It's more complicated if you have a tree.
Yep.
Because, for example, this fact, this argument, or this premise changed people's mind. But then this other, so this premise B changed people's mind about A, but C changed people's mind about B. There's different types of argument. Is C an argument against the relevance of A to B, or is C an argument against B itself?
Or
right?
neither. It
And-
could be a persuasive metaphor or story and not at all an argument.
Interesting. In my mind, anything that persuades is an argument. But yeah, that's the definitions I'm going with.
Interesting. I tend to disagree with that definition, but you could go run with that, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, it's a stretch of the definition, but interesting.
It's kind of like my comment that I was making when I didn't understand informative, right? I was trying to wrap my head around that, where it was like, oh, okay, you have the premise, and then you have the act of informing the premise, and why would there be a delta of, the act of informing giving a greater probability than the premise itself? I was misunderstanding what you were saying, but I was like,
really
well, the
important
answer must be
question.
rhetoric. It must be the way it was said, the informative act.
So I don't think it's that, right? So there's a difference between, because if you say something, like if you make an argument that causes someone to accept the premise, well, now you actually have another premise, right? So if somebody says C and C causes you to believe,
right, it's a tree, right? No, yeah,
right?
sure.
And so, but what happens if you don't actually make an argument that gives someone a reason to believe B? All you do is just claim B. You just say B is true. So I think from a Bayesian perspective, a Bayesian reasoner gets evidence, and the evidence is something that they know for sure. It is the evidence of their own senses. And then everything else is an inference from that. And even you can go farther and say, right, you think you sense something, and the probability that you actually saw something, given you think you saw something, you can kind of really go deep with that. But at some point you can kind of stop and you say, look, this is the information or evidence that I know for sure. And then everything else is an inference from that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true, to be honest. In the sense, like, if I tell you a personal story, you have zero evidence for it.
Yeah,
But
so the evidence I have is that you told me that story. So I infer
exactly.
from the fact
So
that
there's a kind of social convention that, unless evidence otherwise, we'll assume one another to be mostly truthful and honest. And
right.
so we'll believe secondhand accounts as at least plausibly priori. Again.
Right, but the account is evidence, and the conclusion is that the story actually happened, and it's just a Bayesian inference from the fact that you told me the story, to that increases the probability that the story is true in my mind.
Of course. But what I'm saying is, it's okay. You started saying things I've experienced, and I was like, well, not necessarily directly, at least.
Well, so what I mean by experience is I experienced
my
the
retelling
observation of you exactly, or I see on a screen that somebody said something, and that's my evidence, what I saw, and I look at the username as well, and the username changes the strength of the evidence. If it's some expert or somebody I trust, that's much stronger evidence than if it's some random username.
Some of the papers I've been reading discuss, I guess, there being 4 types or sources of certainty, right? Yeah, epistemology, epistemic sources, right? And then the first one is experience, right? That's the strongest one. You saw it, did it, whatever, experienced it yourself. Strangely, apart from that is memory. And I didn't have time to fully wrap my mind around that, because because anything you experience turns into memory immediately, right? But then there's another one, which is it's essentially other people relaying this information to you. It's secondhand
Yeah.
information, right? And so on. I don't know. I'd have to look it up, but in the end, you're right. They're all just different qualities or strengths of reasons to believe something, right?
And would the fourth be deduction? Or
No,
reasoning from those? Because it should be.
no, I'd have to pull it up. No, it was essentially larger distance, more reliance on trust, right? Essentially. I guess deduction, if it's true deduction, is the same thing as experience if it came from experience, or is the same thing from whatever foundation there was.
Yeah, well, the problem is a lot of deduction is empirical or heuristical.
Yeah, well, there's a whole discussion that we need to have about evidence at some point. But so in other words, what you're working on, Jonathan, is very, very, very structurally similar to the canonical debate concept, right? I would say the most fundamental difference is, well, for one thing, we would consider it to be a scoring method, right? And the scoring methods I've come up with are very similar, to that, where you have a premise, and the premise itself is essentially a claim that is going to have its own probability
Score.
of acceptance, right? Its own acceptance score, and that multiplied by the relevance, right, is the term we more or less use for the argument, right? And how it affects the conclusion is a mathematical calculation, a roll-up score that works very similar to the Bayesian math you're doing. I actually have played around with different scoring methods, and they get messy because there's all sorts of edge cases that I don't want to happen. And so I just kind of do sort of, what do you call, imperative rules of if this, then that, if this, then that kind of things. But the general concept is very similar. I was very interested in what you call persuasiveness, but then I thought it was one thing, and then it turned out to be another as I read down. Persuasiveness is more or less what I think called strength of an argument, right?
Well,
Which
that might be what
is
we talked about with criticality, actually.
possibly, yeah.
No, because criticality has to be with it being standalone. See, if there's many concurrent arguments, like if an argument is alone,
True.
it could be critical. And then another argument comes that's independent and sustains, and then it would lose criticality, but not persuasiveness.
Right. But I think that's the same with, well, no, I would actually lose persuasiveness, right? If you have, well, maybe we need a
It
specific
shares
example.
persuasiveness.
So I think it helps to divide the view of Bayesian argumentation into a static and a dynamic view. The dynamic view is what changes when new information comes along. It's the difference between posterior and prior, right? And the new information being somebody said this, right? And how does it cause you to change your beliefs? And then there's a static view, which is just an analysis of how A relates to B, right? And relevance is totally static, right? It's the, something could be relevant, but doesn't change your view because, you already believe B 100% is true, right? So it's relevant, but you're not going to be persuaded by B, but obviously it's relevant. In fact, if it's very relevant and you believe B, it's critical by that definition, right? I was saying that is an analogy to soundness. Logical sound argument is one where the premises are true and the conclusion follows from the premise. Criticality.
Oh, wait a minute. You said
That's not
that.
critical.
Yeah.
If they reject the premise, they would reduce their belief in the conclusion. So if you already believe the conclusion, and then suddenly you stop believing the premise, it won't change your belief in the premise. So it won't reduce your belief in the conclusion.
So really, actually, one follows the other, right? Criticality, and there's actually a proof later on in the essay that says if you believe in B, and if B is relevant to A, then the then your belief in A is greater than your belief in A given not B. And
Right.
criticality really is a static analysis. Like, forget persuasion for a while, right? Let's say we're not looking at a situation where someone has made an argument and changed their mind. Let's say someone's already made all the arguments and now we're analyzing your belief, right? So someone already argued B, let's say it changed your belief, and now we're looking at your posterior after the argument, which is your prior before the next argument, right? But your current state, what we're saying is now, if here's my belief in A, and if I didn't believe in B, it would be lower, right? And mathematically, that's the same as saying I do believe in B, and B is relevant to A.
I think what you're saying is absolutely true, but I don't think that's the case I was discussing.
Yes, you're talking about that interesting phenomenon where, like the
I already
gas.
believe something, absolutely. You give me a relevant argument for it being true. It does not budge my
Doesn't
belief
change,
in
yep.
B, which is already absolute. So it's not critical, it's not persuasive in this case by your definition, though it is relevant, and it would be persuasive if my other reasons to believe B were to crumble.
Right, yep.
So
yeah, but it's actually not relevant in that case, right?
No, it's relevant.
Well, not by that definition, because relevance is probably A given B is different from probably A given not B.
Sorry.
Here's a point.
Okay.
Here's a point I wanted to make that about the scoring, which is the canonical debate approach to scoring is calculating forward, whereas your definitions are exactly the opposite. It's measuring afterwards, right? So it's measuring how something moved, and from that you derive what is its score, right? And in that case, given Marc-Antoine's approach of this person is unmovable, everything's going to have a relevance or a criticality of 0 because the person is unmovable and their score is going to be unmoved. Whereas if you're looking at how this thing should affect everybody, right? If you want to look at, it's more objective, although the canonical debate is not objective, right? It's very, very subjective as well. The scoring is subjective, because what the way we handle it, or the way I handle it in my mind and in my paper, is a person declares their belief, their score on something, on a claim, right? And they separately declare their scores for relevance and agreement with premises and arguments and so on and so forth, right? And what you end up with is exactly the most important point, which is scores that disagree, right? The unmovable person gives 100%, and they may see that, oh, but if you look at their scores at details down below, it doesn't add up to 100%.
It doesn't add up. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Of course. No, I'm realizing I was mixing notion of relevance in a more logical, absolute sense with the notion of relevance you've defined.
Oh yeah, you were saying it is relevant or it isn't in an absolute objective sense, right?
In a logical,
right.
Logical structure.
So it's kind of the biggest dilemma of this account of argumentation. I discussed that at the end, right? Where you said earlier, it's context dependent, right? It's whether this is relevant depends on my other beliefs. And that doesn't seem right. And the example I gave is, I argue that the car won't start because it's out of batteries. But if the car is also out of gas, it makes no difference whether it's out of batteries or not. And so by my definition of relevant, it's not relevant. PA given car out of batteries is equal to
and exactly by
and yet it's clearly very relevant.
But see, it's order dependent.
Yes, it depends on the order, right? What claims you accept, right? And then something becomes irrelevant.
Well, you may accept both, but what claims budge you is order dependent.
And that depends on order, yep. Right.
Whereas the impact, you may both accept both claims as relevant in that you have a perfectly consistent or realistic belief system that both the gas and the battery are necessary for the car to start. And that your model would declare one of them to be irrelevant, when in my mind, certainly they're not. They're both equally relevant.
Well, it depends on the state of the the Bayesian reasoner's mind, right? In fact, only one of them can be relevant if the subject does not accept the other. So it's very dissatisfying, and it obviously doesn't capture the concept of relevance that we intuitively have. And there's a couple of avenues, and I mentioned them just briefly because I haven't really explored them. There's the idea of possible worlds, and this is an area of philosophy that I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around. But I know, there's a lot of writing in this area, and there's the idea of similar possible worlds. And so I think it could be the idea that out of gas is relevant, even though the battery is dead, because in other similar possible worlds, the battery's not dead. And then out of gas, would make a difference, right? So there's one kind. I need to. That's not at all concrete
you
yet.
mentioned Pearl, because Pearl goes into that in quite a lot of detail.
Oh yeah, right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I was like, where's Pearl in there? He's mentioned, but there's all this relevant causality stuff that.
Yeah, and there's a probability of necessity and the probability of sufficiency, and so that actually, but I haven't, and I've been reading Pearl, and yet I still haven't wrapped my head around how to make that connection.
Fair.
That's as far as I've
fair
gone.
enough. Fair enough. I will be perfectly honest. I'm still also struggling a bit with Pearl. I'm getting more used to it, but I haven't tried to do what you're doing.
I wouldn't even try. It got to the point where it's, I don't do this science, so I'm not going to spend my time figuring it out. But the idea is interesting. Yeah.
There's actually a third route. Just briefly, Tolman has the idea of rebuttal. And it's the idea of this is a warrant except if these other conditions are true, right?
Correct.
And so I think there might be something in there where he talks about how the warrant may or may not apply based on different circumstances, and there may be something helpful.
I guess my understanding of warrant was wrong. I never studied it enough. I skimmed through some basic reading in courses, but I thought warrant was essentially what we considered an argument in support of an argument, right? But as you've described it, a warrant is the scheme of connecting the premise to the conclusion, the reason you should believe the premise affects the conclusion.
Right. Yeah, the inferential rule. That's how Tolman describes it.
Even that, I think, is a bit of a restrictive definition of how I understand Tolman's warrant. It's for me, in a way, the warrant is the micro theory, and the ground is why the micro theory works.
Wait, the backing you
mean. The backing, sorry. Yeah, the backing. And so it's not just basic facts, but it's kind of the underlying epistemology that makes this relevant to that. Like, why is that even relevant? Well, because of this underlying worldview that makes this relevant to that.
Well, so I say an inferential rule, but that could be a whole worldview, right? It's just whatever justifies in the mind.
Yeah.
And a great example from Tolman was, Peterson is a Roman Catholic because he's a Swede. So there's an unexpressed premise there that a Swede can be taken for a Roman Catholic, probably, or generally, right? It's a general rule. It's not a hard logical rule. It's just,
so heuristic.
People believe that Swedes, heuristic, right? And then the backing is often data that justifies the heuristic, and he talks about induction, right? Induction is coming up with these heuristics from experience or from data, turning them into rules.
So what the canonical debate tries to do is break that all down even further, right? It deconstructs it into Okay, you are supporting the relevance of this argument by saying it's because he's a Swede, and then
another,
you're supporting the because he's a Swede with because
right.
Swedes are generally Catholic, and then you come up with evidence, and you are supporting that with all the different kind of evidence you can gather, and of course you can counter that evidence by saying, oh, this was made up or whatever,
Right.
But yeah.
So you're articulating the warrant, right? And you're making that into an explicit claim, or you're
Right.
making the backing into an explicit claim, right? So it's sort of indirect, right? Like if in CDL you had Peterson is a Roman Catholic premise, Peterson is a Swede, and then you would say the reason that this premise is relevant to the conclusion is here's the data on religion and population in Sweden, right? And in that, Tolman would call that the backing, because that's not an inferential rule, that's just data, right? But still, that data supports the claim that you can infer A from B.
If you're looking at rebuttals, I really recommend looking at Walton's argumentation schemes book.
Yeah, that's on my list. Yep.
Because he goes into the rebuttal approaches to everything in there. But to be absolutely honest, I don't think it solves the car problem, or at least not well. Like here we're speaking about two independent paths to a conclusion. And I don't think that the fact that there's another path is a rebuttal. It's just that the notion
maybe not
of informativeness, and I'm trying to think, how would I treat it? And what comes to mind is kind of ceteris paribus, right? Saying, if all other things were equal, then hey,
then this would be relevant. Yeah.
What assumption? Yeah, exactly.
Well, no, but okay. So the canonical debate approach to it is essentially you consider each one on their own. Is this thing true? Is it relevant? Right? How relevant is it? Right? Is this other thing true? How relevant is it? And then there's a math that adds them up.
That's relevant in abstracto. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe you can't do that though, like independently. You can't they're just not additive, right? You can't add.
But no, it's not additive. But like the way I've done it is essentially that kind of, well, if it is 90%, what is it, critical? If the criticality is 90% of each, then that's going to be 90%, which leaves 10%, and 90% of that leaves essentially 1% of doubt. It's something like that, the way it works.
Right.
I have a stupid question, in the sense that thinking about probabilities is not something humans are good at. Asking people, what's your expectation of this, and what's your strength of belief of that. And of course, I don't expect them to add up. And my big question is, does it matter, right? As long as let me finish.
I am, yeah.
As I said earlier, this is just a delta, and we want to know the highest delta. And in a way, it's enough. And I think it's enough for your collective. You want to know, okay, people who believe this are more prone to go this way, though I'm sure there are interesting cases where being exposed to a certain information will sway different people in different directions, which I don't know how it would be treated in the aggregate.
Well, I think it's really interesting. Briefly, there's a whole thing with polis and clustering, and so there's some interesting things there. Like to find clusters of people that are swayed in different ways and different aggregates.
Fascinating.
But anyways, go on.
Now, well, what I'm saying is, do we need something that adds up to an exact probability to achieve the basic goal of let's get people the most useful information they have, so they make informed, so their opinions are informed? Or is it enough to identify the largest deltas? Does it have to add
Well,
to one?
I think it depends on the goal, right? I think.
Yes, that's exactly
Yeah.
the question.
Yeah.
What is the goal here?
Yeah. Well, my goal is it's also a heuristic, right? It's to identify things that are that you're more likely to believe if you knew more, right?
Yep.
And
Which can be done with the delta, highest delta.
although I think that there's, I do think even though you need the idea of joint relevance, right? How these two things together are relevant. In my essay on the argument model, I talk about argument threads, and an argument thread is a chain of what I call warrant arguments or relevant arguments, right? And what this says is it directly, arguments often very directly approach the fact that what you say may be relevant, but not in this case because of this other thing, right? So here's an argument thread. The car is not going to start. Why? Well, and this actually is not a good example. But here's a better example, right? We talked about before. We should take Jimmy to the hospital. Why? He was stung by a bee, right? And you say, well, that's not relevant. Bee stings are not
Lethal.
Lethal, but Jimmy's allergic. Yeah, but we have an EpiPen. Yeah, but the EpiPen is broken, right? Right? And so the relevance, if you think about it, all those are independent claims, and they depends on the order. Whether one is relevant depends on what you already accepted as the claims. And
no, I disagree with that. The order is important because the response depended on the one that came. But if you were to collect that, like the structure of the tree is order dependent, because whichever one you say first is the one that's going to create the response, is going to create the response to the structure of the tree is. But the information in the end should, regardless of which way you structure it, can't have the arguments cancel out until you have the general thing of, it's still, he got a bee sting and he's allergic. There were lots of ways we could have fixed it. We can't fix it with all these ways. And that's the one piece that's left.
What you're saying basically is A given B, C, D, E is equal to A given E, D, C, B, right? And that's absolutely true, right? Once you've accepted all the premises, if you're a Bayesian reasoner, your belief is the same. But now if we're trying to measure relevance, what you're measuring very different things, right? A given B, but not yet C, D, and E, right? B may be relevant or may be totally irrelevant, but once you've accepted B, C, or C and D, and then you add B, it might totally change.
Okay, but that's with your measurement, right? Your measurement is of deltas. Yeah.
Well,
No, it's more than that. It's the idea is if you have a real tree, and it's not, I agree that the chain is order dependent, but the tree shouldn't be, right? In the sense that if you say, but we've got
you can't respond to, we should take him to the hospital, why we don't have an EpiPen, right? You're missing information. You can't connect the tree like that. That's hanging off the round thing.
That's exactly it. The information becomes relevant when the whole chain is, it could be inferred, but it has to be there somewhere in someone's mind for the information to become.
But the whole, so the whole goal or purpose of the canonical debate is it shouldn't be order dependent. It should be.
But you're saying that we can give relevance to, we don't have an EpiPen. You can say that this is relevant to, we should take Timmy to the hospital independently of everything else, right?
No, but you wouldn't connect it to because you're missing way too many premises. You wouldn't connect it directly. We don't have an EpiPen is a reason you're giving for something, right? So you have to have first stated the something.
The EpiPen is broken,
Well, so the EpiPen is broken, right?
But so in my model of an argument thread, whenever you make an argument in the context of a thread, so you say, given that Timmy's allergic to bees and he's been stung by a bee and he has an EpiPen, what is the relevance of the fact that the EpiPen is broken?
Well,
that
but
makes
see,
sense.
what is the relevance? And here you're saying, what is the relevance to what?
To the conclusion, A.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
To-
the
and to
relevance
We should take
of
him to the
D
hospital,
to
right?
A
But,
given B and C.
No,
right,
to the whole
but
structure.
yeah, but here's or to the whole structure. But you know, from the canonical debate perspective, what you're really having is that there's a canonical claim there, which is we can't use the EpiPen, or the EpiPen won't help, or something like that, right? And the EpiPen is broken is the argument in support of the EpiPen won't help us, right? And that is essentially canonical. It doesn't matter why you're talking about the EpiPen. The relevance to the EpiPen being broken is its relevance to the fact that it's not going to work, right? The EpiPen isn't going to work itself is relevant to something else, which is we can use an EpiPen to help this person who's allergic, to stop this person's allergic reaction, right?
There's a
If
canonical.
that was the structure, right? But that's not the structure of this particular argument, right?
No, that's the way it came. No, you did a much more organic and natural way, and people skip over those little.
But
the
that's the
canonical
point.
structure would have to be different. Yeah.
The canonical, the structure is not the same as the order of utterance.
Mhm.
Correct.
All right. So let's see. So you restructure it so that there's a claim we can use an EpiPen to solve this problem, right? And then the argument the EpiPen is broken becomes what I call a premise argument, right? It's no longer, and then then it does become context independent, and that's a really important concept, right? And so you're no longer that claim. Let's call it C. The EpiPen is broken. It is now relevant directly only to B, that we can use an EpiPen to fix this problem, right?
Correct.
It's not relevant to be given any other set of premises.
Correct.
However, I'm not sure you can restructure every single argument in that way. So that
is why we've been trying, and we have debates about this, but you know, there is a question. First of all, there's a question like restructuring or refactoring, we fully recognize would have to be necessary. Not just because nobody speaks in a fully canonical structure, right? You end up having to piece apart or reorganize, but also there is sort of I don't think there's a canonical structure to a given debate. Structure itself is not canonical. You can connect them in different orders. So the order you do it in does affect the structure. And one of the challenges for scoring something like the canonical debate is coming up with a scoring mechanism in which equivalent structures give equivalent results. We don't know if that is
that's a
possible.
good question. Can we canonicalize? I haven't lost hope of canonicalizing, but certainly at this point, I'm more interested in how can we do, I'm not thinking so much about scoring, but how can we do, for example, distributed search? Or how can we automate the equivalence class, like finding of equivalence between the structure if we cannot canonicalize it, which is another way to say, can we canonicalize it, really? My interest in federated search, but it doesn't matter how
We've had this discussion before too, right?
What's important is if I've constructed it one way historically and you've constructed it another way, we want to be able to make them equivalent. And we want to be able to declare the equivalence. And maybe that's a separate thing, and maybe that's contestable because we may or may not agree with the refactoring rule. But I think it's important to be able to state these two are the same as a meta claim.
There's probably some sort of mathematical proof of isomorphism to some degree, to the degree that I mean I know there are for graphs, but specifically for the canonical debate, if you have truly canonical claims, then
yes,
I think I could So what I'm trying to wrap my head around is the idea that you can refactor any debate so that there's no idea of conditional relevance, where so
No,
let's
that's not what we're saying.
um,
There's no idea of we kind of write out the temporality of how it was built. We build towards the same structure, no matter in which order the arguments come.
right. Well, but let's take a simple example. Let's do the hospital, Jimmy to the hospital thing, but limit it to 3 arguments, right?
Right.
A, we should take Jimmy to the hospital. B, he was stung by a bee. C, he is allergic to bees.
Right.
Now, B and C together, obviously very relevant to A. If B is not true, C is not relevant. And if C is not true, B is not relevant.
Yeah. You have jointly necessary
Yeah,
conditions.
exactly. Jointly necessary. And so
So
you can't score those.
Yeah, so this is another debate we've totally been stuck on, and we'll come back to many times, which is, is this a multi-premise argument, right? He was stung by a bee, and
He's allergic.
He's allergic. Therefore, it's a what do you call it? It's almost a
It's a syllogism.
syllogism, right?
It's not a syllogism, actually. It's there's a few things missing, but
right. No, there's missing premises and things, and his allergy might be life-threatening, and the hospital is the only place that could treat him, or the best place to treat him. So on. There's a bunch of stuff in there, but it's the same sort
and
of
we
structure.
want him to survive. And
but in a syllogy, there isn't a necessary order either, right?
No.
Order
is not.
All men are mortal. Oh no, what is it? Aristotle is mortal, or whatever.
Socrates is mortal.
Socrates is mortal. I always forget. Right.
But so there's
because there's 2 conditions that need to be true, right? Yeah.
And it's not order dependent. Yeah.
Right. But you can say some concrete things about those arguments if you know the beliefs of some subject who's a Bayesian reasoner, right? So suppose that person believes, as would be reasonable, that given not B and not C, not A, right? Given B, but not C, still not A. Given C, but not B, still not A. But given 2 together, A, right? That's
right.
What do you say in that case?
It's dependent on the intersection or a conjunction.
We do an and. We do, yeah, exactly.
It's a conjunction.
Exactly.
And you can make arguments attacking either claim separately.
Yep, exactly.
That's conjunctions
premise
work.
arguments. Yep. And if you attack either of them, then you attack the conjunction. But we can concretely say in that case that B, the conjunction of B and C is relevant to A. What we can also do is say that B is relevant to A given C. It's basically using conditional probabilities. And you can say that C is relevant to A given B. And that's something we can concretely define. We can even measure conditional relevance.
With your definition of relevance, we can even say that A is relevant to B, even not knowing C, right?
Well,
because we don't know if C or not C, we're not sure. So C might be true. So A.
Well, that's what he said, like given C, that's the same thing as given. Let's assume C.
Right.
Yeah, what I'm saying is even without C, even with C unknown,
right?
It's not relevant if C is known to be false, but it is.
There are conditions under which it's relevant. Yeah, and I think maybe there's another term besides relevance, like potential relevance, right? And again, I've chosen the term relevance just for the simple difference between A given B minus A given not B, right? And if we're using the term for that definition, we need something else for like this potential, or we need another term. And maybe what I've defined shouldn't be relevance. We should use some other term for that.
Well, no, but it is relevant. What it is it's transiently relevant. What you have is you replace B and C with a new letter D, right? In which you are unsure at this moment of the probability of D, but D is indeed relevant to A, right? Given D.
What's D?
Yeah.
D is the conjunction B and
Conjunction,
C.
yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, sure. But what I'm saying is, even without the conjunction, A is relevant to B.
Well, depending on the definition of relevant, right? If we're stuck with the definition I gave,
Well, certainly with the one you gave.
no.
Yes.
No,
If
because if C is false, then the
no,
probability
no,
they,
but again, I'm not saying it's relevant given not C. I'm saying it's relevant given
But
C unknown. Okay.
the problem is that A isn't an argument.
You don't know if your B is allergic, if your kid is allergic to bees or not. So in doubt, you'll send the kid to the hospital because you don't know if your kid's allergic yet. You've never tested
What
it.
you've done is you sort of changed the warrant, right?
well,
Um,
well, and the kind of, yeah. And if we have a subject, he has beliefs, right? The subject either believes, B or not, or something in between, and they believe B or not, or something in between. So if the subject, in fact, does not believe B, if B is 0, then PA given C is equal to PA given not C.
No. PA given C and not B is equal to PA given C and not B. That's
Right.
what I'm
But the
trying
question
to.
is, but if not B is what the agent believes,
Exactly.
because all conditional probabilities are
What I'm
always,
saying is,
if I did believe this, right? But I might not believe, right? So like I don't believe that the building I'm in is going to burn down right now. But if I did believe it, then I would believe I should leave.
what I'm trying to say is, you're right that we need to look at P of B given learning about A, but we need to consider separately how B is affected by A and ignorance, knowledge, or denial of C, because they're different.
I'm not sure I'm following you. A is in my
Okay.
document conclusion and B is premise.
Okay. Sorry. So I may have said it wrong then. So A is we should bring Tommy to the hospital.
Yep.
He's been stung by a bee. Now, of course, he's been stung by a bee may increase the probability if we should bring him to the hospital, either if we know he's allergic or if we don't know whether he's allergic. The only case where it doesn't say that is if we do know he isn't, which is, one of 3 cases.
Yeah.
But I'm saying they have totally different behaviors. And it's very
Right.
nice to look at P of A given B, but you need to look at P of A given B, P of A given B, and C.
And C.
I
Yeah,
get it.
totally.
I get it. Yeah.
Yep.
It's
Yeah, and I agree with that too, right?
Yep.
And that's
Well,
why
so
you
this-
can't give a score to B's relevance to A and C's relevance to A independently.
You can totally say, given that C is unknown and given that the prior on C is this, then the P of B given P of A given B can be calculated with a huge uncertainty.
Well, right. So if your prior, so let's say your prior of C is 1, then the relevance of B to A is high. If your prior on C is 0, then your relevance of B to A is low.
If your prior is I don't have a bloody clue, and I know
a Bayesian reasoner can't have that, right?
Yeah.
But
no,
what
but I was not done, and
I don't have a
know-
clue. It's 50-50.
No.
Yeah.
And I know that the incidence of population is whatever, 1 in 100. The incidence of the allergy in the population is 1 in 100. Then
that would be your prior, right? That would inform your prior, right?
That would inform my prior.
Your knowledge of incidence in the population, along with maybe your knowledge that Jimmy tends to be allergic to things, that might increase it, right?
So that's interesting. Wait. So let's pause on that for a second. That would be your prior. And so somebody comes and states, 1 in 100 people are allergic to bee stings. To the person who had that embedded in their prior, it's not informative, right? There's a 0 change. to somebody who didn't have that built into their prior, it's informative, right? Is that correct?
So we're talking about informativeness. So, um, but yeah,
And that's really interesting, because suppose I were in that situation. And, oh, I think incidence is around 1%. But I'm not sure. Maybe it's more than that. So I'd be worried. And then somebody tells me, you know, it's really 1 in 100. I know my medicine. I know it's 1 in 100. I trust that person. So it's interesting, because it's not changing my prior. It's changing my confidence in my prior.
right. Yeah, and there's some really interesting stuff I've read about the difference between your belief as a probability and then your confidence in that belief.
Yeah.
But that ultimately, I think, doesn't well,
It's adding
I have
information.
nothing.
You know what's
think
interesting
about what I want to say.
One effect, and this doesn't go into my design, or it doesn't probably go into what you're working on necessarily, but it would throw off all of this, is the accessibility bias, right? Which is, maybe it was 1 in 100 and it was built into your prior, but by saying it again, it becomes more real, and suddenly that's the number you fixate on, right?
Yep.
So you already knew it.
Availability. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if it's informative again or something. It affects you somehow just by being reminded of something.
I can certainly seeing there being a uncertainty on the prior. And so you're saying, so the chance of Jimmy dying is between, 1 in 100 to 1 in 5, because maybe I remember wrong. And now somebody tells me it's really 1
I
in
see. Yeah.
100. Might be better.
Yeah, there's a lot of points I wanted to talk about there. And there's one that's just been nagging at me, so I should go there. But yeah, I'll talk about the one that's been nagging me, and then I'll try to remember the other ones later. But there's the question of informativeness as measure, right? Doesn't exist in my ideas of the canonical debate. I mean, there's no score for informativeness, right? It's just, do you believe or agree with the premise, and how relevant is this argument to you, or how relevant is it to the conclusion? But this notion of measuring something afterwards, right? Measuring a delta afterwards, that sort of thing. Yeah. As opposed to calculating it forward. The informativeness score is an interesting thing to consider for one of the problems we have with the canonical debate, which is this. It's kind of like the B and C conjunction. Well, you have a B affects A and a C affects A, and B and C affects A, right? And so how informative is each of those? There's got to be some sort of overlap there, right? The example of he doesn't have a pulse, right? It's informativeness, but he has a pulse, right? Is what you said. But if he doesn't have a pulse, that's even more interesting.
Then it would be
it's a little more critical. Yeah.
What was the example again? I forgot.
The argument,
should we hire this person? Oh, he has a pulse.
Has a pulse.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yes.
Yeah. But
it's the only good thing.
If you also add in there, he is alive, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you have two separate arguments. He has a pulse and he is alive.
Right.
What you have is he is alive is the summation of a bunch of other things, like he has a pulse, right? And so that one hides behind.
Yep. And it's what I call a premise argument, right? You can kind of hide all these arguments and make them an independent argument tree, right? You can even have a whole bunch of different people go off and decide, is he alive, right? And then they can provide evidence for whether or not he's alive. And they don't have to take into consideration the larger context of, is this guy good at math or whatever, right? To decide if he's alive. But then that conclusion, if he's alive, can now feed into the formula.
Right. And so
higher.
this is one of the things we think about a lot is in terms of refactoring a canonical debate, because it's created in a certain order, but at some point you get to the point where you have something that is less informative or really should be an argument supporting one thing because it sounded important because nobody had brought it up before, but really in between is he has a pulse, therefore he's alive, therefore,
Yep.
right? And so you need to refactor, right?
Yep.
And what got me thinking is whether something like informativeness, the question is, when should you refactor? What should be refactored? How should it be refactored, right? One of the things we've been talking about is essentially, because, you know, an example I use a lot is immigration, right? Immigration is good, immigration is bad, whatever. And then you come with a study from 1913 about immigration affecting border towns in Texas, right? And you're using that to support immigration is good or immigration is bad, right? That's one study. It's pretty distant from the conclusion. But if you had a separate debate that is, was immigration good or bad for Texas in the beginning of the 20th century, you know, in border towns, that's a lot more relevant. And so there's a relevance score. And so to some degree, restructure the debate because you have another argument that could be essentially a piece of the immigration thing is like, is immigration good in this place? Is immigration good in that place? Is immigration good for that person? Is immigration good for that group of people? That sort of thing. These all add up to the general form of immigration is good or bad. And so
I have
you
an
want to
answer.
structure the debate so that each one enters in at only one point in this tree, and you want it to hit at where it's most relevant. Right.
So I think I have an answer there. Again, using the Bayesian argumentation model, you could create this rule, and it's based on conditional independence. And so let's take again the example of he has a pulse, he is alive, right?
They're not independent.
Obviously, they're not independent, and none of them are independent. A is not independent of C, right? Because obviously he has a pulse changes your belief in A. A is, so they're all
some degree is getting back to Pearl.
There is a conditional independence that is, let me see if I'm saying it right, that A is conditionally independent of C given B. And I've written that explanation somewhere, I think in the distributed Bayesian reasoning article. And the idea is that, and there's also in the idea of, there's like, there's some great terminology where conditional independence is used like in Markov chains, and there's like the idea of Markov, I forgot the term, but it's basically saying that B only if C only affects A through B, right?
Right.
And there's not a direct link between C and A, right? And so, and you can define that mathematically. It uses this little operator, right? The right angle.
Except that, yeah, in the case of immigration, that's not necessarily true, right?
No, but it does solve the canonicalization of pulse and alive, because clearly pulse, it's from pulse to alive to whatever, and not the other way around. Right. But yeah, for the immigration, it's more about it's a sample, but it's a sample in a very diluted pond, if you see what I mean. It's given very little information, given how much information we know could exist about this. This is a very small part of the pool of information we expect to exist in this broader context than in this narrower context.
Right. At one level of generality, it's an anecdote, and at another level, it could be very, very relevant. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, it would be interesting to maybe look at, I don't know if informativeness is the same thing as measuring relevance from the canonical debate perspective. Or there's a way, I don't know if you can measure informativeness except by seeing people interact over time with the system.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, but I do think it's important to do that, by the way. The whole what sways people, it's like at some point there's going to be thousands of arguments, many of them of low persuasive value, and being able to guide people to, well, here's what people think is the most important one way or another, as a way to guide people to the most important, the decisive arguments, because what's the point of fighting the non-decisive argument? Now, there's a bit of a paradox in there, because a lot of decisive arguments are wrong. I don't know
absolutely.
how to read that.
Well, you allow for counter argument, right? And just hope that with each argument and counter argument in the thread, there's more information.
Yeah,
and hopefully you converge on truth with the addition of information.
the question is, if the counter argument is technical and complex, it won't be decisive.
Yeah,
That's how it is.
right. And hopefully refactoring will help with that. So another thing that could be very valuable is asking people hypotheticals, right? And that's kind of what maybe that's your default, Tim, but it's like, okay, do you believe in B? No. Well, if you did believe in B, how would this affect your belief in A? And that's really valuable data, right? Because now we know how B affects A, right? And even though you don't believe in B, if the sub-argument, different group of people go argue B and conclude that B is probably true, then we can still use your data that says, if B was true, I would believe in A.
Right. If you have a good faith
result.
actor, right, exactly. That's the relevance measure, is like, I don't believe this is true, but if it were true, it would mean everything, right?
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
Abortion is murder is a big one. Do you believe it's murder or not?
Right.
If you believe it's murder, it should change your
yes,
opinion.
then I would believe it was wrong, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And the whole idea about good faith is something, that's the whole peer prediction, something that's like an orthogonal, not necessarily totally orthogonal, but we got to be able to solve that, right? Because it's all crap if people are acting, if all the data is just bots.
Oh, a lot of it is
agents, and so we got to be able to deal with, find some way to get.
We are the
faith data,
Byzantine
honest
situation.
data.
This is why the work on the other work you refer to is extremely
the
interesting.
peer prediction stuff, yeah.
Yeah, that's
It's
the
really
one I'm
fascinating.
about.
I've recently actually brought a book. I don't know if I brought it here, and it's just brilliant stuff. It's hard to get through, but it's sort of it's actually already a few years old.
Okay.
But it summarizes up to like 2014, sort of the state of the art. And then the same author has written some, both of these authors has written some recent stuff that's pretty good.
Okay, I'll definitely look into that. Now, the question I've mentioned recently, I can't find it, which is strange. I've mentioned recently the How Minds Change. Did you read that?
No, I haven't. Who's the author?
What's his name? Mac Randy. It's let me just get Mac Rainey, sorry. Here is, okay, first, let's be clear. It's written like a pop science book, which I find infuriating. But there's a lot of very good material. And he's going into basically people who are trying to get people to open up. And what is fascinating is how it has nothing to do with argument. And it's all about asking people, okay, what do you believe about this? How strongly do you believe that?
it? Yeah.
And why do you believe it?
Yeah.
And getting them to reason about their epistemic ground. And that helps them up to a point to reevaluate new facts with respect to that ground. And sometimes without doing anything, without pushing, it helps them budge, because giving them this opportunity to rethink, okay, why do I believe this? It's very interesting. And there's a lot of value beyond that, but that's one of the key findings.
Yeah. I think the problem I'm trying to solve is kind of like almost dissecting the anatomy of belief to the point where you could say you can do all these hypotheticals, and ultimately You can say, if this person thought this was false, they believe that. They think it's true, therefore they believe this other thing. And if they thought these two things were true, they would believe that. And kind of getting the whole.
I think most of the time, what will make them change their mind is not changing their mind about a prior belief, but enriching their basis of like making them accept other perspectives, like enriching their belief of enriching their perspective. I think it's really what it is. I mean, it's well known that literature does achieve that goal.
Yeah. Right.
People who are well read have better emotional intelligence. That's the result.
Yeah. I think there's two goals for things related to scoring, right? Oh, Tim, I can't hear you. Marc-Antoine, can you hear Tim?
Sorry, no, I was my daughter's talking to me and I was responding to her.
So there's the goal of identifying quality beliefs, right? Or, the group decision making, or identifying something that's more likely to be true, right? And that's kind of dangerous because it's all subjective, right? So you can't say objectively this is more likely to be true than that based on my system. That's all powerful. What you can do is saying, you can make the claim that the average person in this group, assuming that they're honest, would would accept or reject this claim if they all shared the same information, right? And that's a little bit different from, but very related to the goal of informing people and helping people see inconsistencies in their own reasoning, and changing minds. But a great example of how this system can change minds is that it identifies that you believe B, right? And that belief in B is critical to your belief in A. And you identify that other people that heard C are not likely to believe B, right? And you can deduce that C is now going to change your mind. And that if it doesn't, there's more discussion to be had. And you want to know why, right? If C doesn't change your mind about B, why? And if it does change your mind about B, but then you didn't change your mind about A when you said that you would, then that says something, right?
Or maybe you have another reason for believing A that only came to mind when B crumbled.
Right. Yep. Which happens all the time. Right.
Which happens
and
all the time.
Often people at that point, people are really reaching for pretty weak justification.
They may be grasping for straws or not.
Yeah. Moving goalposts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or not.
Or not, right? Yeah. Because sometimes people just come up with the first thing that comes off the top of their head, right? And but they really actually do have other reasons. They just didn't, come up with them at first. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, we become aware of our beliefs when we discuss them.
Right. Yep.
Of our reasons to believe, or our epistemic ground when we discuss it. Mostly the beliefs we kind of know, but the epistemic ground for it, we only become aware of it when we discuss it. And that way, anything that forces us to, that elicits reflection on epistemic ground is useful.
Well, this has been an interesting discussion.
It's been fun for me. Yeah. It was exciting for me also just to see how much, I mean, your article is seeing similarities between, again, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was Bayesian reasoning versus
argumentation theory.
Tolman model. Argumentation theory. Yeah. And I'm seeing similarities because we're very similar to the Tolman model, right? Similarities between your scoring mechanism and our plans for scoring mechanisms. I think it'll be interesting to revisit when we finally get around to designing our scoring mechanisms, because it's been like 3 years we've been putting off that discussion.
I just had the conversation with Bentley, by the way, about the scoring mechanism. And one thing I realized, like, he was like, oh yeah, it's a kind of adding the different reasons, right? And I'm like, no, you don't do that. And then I realized, yes, of course, you do that when you're looking at not factors to believe something, where we take the strongest reason minus the strongest reason to disbelieve. So you go for a max, not for a sum. But if you're looking at, if we do this, it will have this impact and that impact and that impact. So then you add the positive and negative impacts and do a kind of weighted sum. And it's perfectly valid in that case. So I realized that the aggregation depends on the modality. For deontic logic, you want to add to do a weighted sum. For epistemic, you want to go for max pro minus max con, so to speak. It's a different aggregation method.
I think I got that at the end, what you were saying. Yeah, the interesting thing about Bentley's scoring, it was with his that I finally realized, understood the importance of what you guys just said, which is, if it doesn't match what you wanted, maybe there's another argument out there. If it doesn't match your belief, you got to figure that out. But with Bentley's scoring, it's very cold, purely mathematical. There's no Bayesian aspect to it whatsoever. It's like this argument adds a point, that argument subtracts a point. And then there's arguments can weight other arguments and some things like that. So that's how you get relevance, is by weighting, but through more argument. And what it does is it creates this weird adversarial situation where people just keep making up arguments to win.
It's very easy to flood with garbage, yeah.
Yeah, you can game it, but what's interesting is that it forces you, if it's not matching what you expected, to come up with missing reasons, right? It's a forcing function to fill out the map, maybe too much, but yeah.
That's useful, actually.
So a little mental model I had, a little exercise I went through when thinking about scoring, is thinking about what situations would I consider to result in the same score. So let's say we have one argument, one pro, and 10 people agree with it, right? Or let's say we have 10 pros, and for each of those pros, one person agrees with it. Are those scored the same? And why?
That's interesting.
So like the canonical debate approach is that seeing yes, it was scored probably identically. I'd have to see the structure of how it came up. It would be scored identically, but that would be a one score, which is the aggregate popular score. But usually the more important ones are your own personal score. Or maybe being able to see the personal score of somebody that disagrees with you. And so in that exploration, it would, maybe there is a score that shows diversity of opinion. It's the diversity of opinion score. You could layer that on, but yeah.
And so maybe
it's interesting because, sorry, they have such different structures, and that a refutation is deadly in the first case and absolutely innocuous in the second.
Yep.
So I don't know if I'd score them the same, but they certainly don't behave the same way.
So now,
well, it depends on,
yeah. But now if you take into consideration informativeness, you look at not just, right, now you have 10 people and they said, this is my reason for believing B. But did any one of those statistically make a difference in anybody's beliefs? And now you need to start looking at ratios. How many people agree, disagree, right? Is there one of those arguments where, someone changed their mind after seeing that argument? They used to disagree and now they agree, right? Now that's a very different, even though it's one only single data point, it's still a data point that has value and under Bayesian inference.
Actually, let's take your case in the same way. You have 10, in one case, you have one argument that changed 10 people's mind, and the other case, you have 10 arguments that each changed one person's mind.
Yeah, and
Same.
then I'd probably say that that's the same, right? And thinking of things, yeah, because it's just a refactoring, right? They could be, well, and
it's very different,
right?
I think it's very different.
Yeah.
They could
It-
have the same content essentially.
They could have. Here, I'm assuming that the arguments are distinguishable, and that suppose everybody read all arguments. So that means each argument is on
Right.
its face quite unconvincing. It only convinces one person in 10.
That's totally possible, right? One is
Well-
the Elvis argument, the Elvis, the one that everybody likes, you know, whatever.
Right.
And the other is like one really good punk artist, a really good classical artist, a really
Well,
good.
So if you think in terms of information content, right? In that last case you just described, where everybody reads all arguments, right? And 10 minds were changed. Then you'd say that the information content of those 10 arguments that changed 10 minds is the same as the information content of that one argument that changed 10 minds. You just don't know where the information content resides, which of those 10 arguments has the content.
Sorry, I was being silly.
No, it's all right.
Michael J. Fox, yes, the anti-Elvis. You know the song, right?
I don't know the song, no.
Oh, do Google that song. It's absolutely hilarious.
Elvis is everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Sorry.
So I have a couple of pieces of follow-up. I don't know if Tim, you're interested in that idea of Markov chains and how you can and shielding, and there's some other terms, basically how you can basically refactor your argument and find independent subtrees.
Yes.
Given you have a probability distribution, right, which means that you have to kind of take the Bayesian, you have to have some subject, and if you know the beliefs of that subject, then you could refactor the argument. But of course, the beliefs of everybody is different, so you got that problem.
But couldn't you just ask, as in, if your belief in A changed, would that change your belief in B? If your belief in B changed, would that change your belief in A? And that gives you a kind of, okay, that's their causality arrow.
Yeah, I mean, you could ask people and determine the arrows. Yep, totally. Yeah.
Easier.
Yeah. And of course, then you can go the other way, right? So once you have those causality arrows, then you can derive from that like an aggregate Bayesian belief probability distribution. So the idea of the meta reasoner, right, which kind of aggregates everybody's beliefs.
Again, we're coming back to aim here. Is your aim to model the belief system of individuals and or populations? I think we quite agree that individuals are not Bayesian reasoners. Is that, and that means you won't get a good accurate model of individuals. That doesn't mean you cannot get an accurate model of populations, though I'm totally unsure about this. Does this converge or not? It's a very good mathematical question. And is that necessary? I mean, if the goal is to identify key decisive arguments, you don't need to have an accurate mental model. You just need to see what empirically sways people.
Yeah. So my goal is to have, basically, is aggregation, right? And there's, are you familiar with the deliberative dilemma or the discursive dilemma or the doctrinal paradox? It's got different names.
Not under that name anyway. Go ahead.
And it's who's the author? French, I forget, but it's the idea that you can, the classic case where you have three judges and they judge on, let's say they all believe that if you have the means and the motive, then you're guilty, right? And the majority of judges believe you have the means, and the majority of judges believe he had the motives, but majority does not believe he's guilty, right? And that's logically inconsistent. And yet, if you look at each individual judge's beliefs, they're logically consistent.
Right.
And the reason is the first judge thought means but not motive, right? So let's say there's 3 judges, right? And
Okay, now I'm remembering this. Yes, I've
right.
seen it before.
So what you
Thanks.
have is individual consistency, logical consistency, but in aggregate, inconsistency. And actually, I've thought a ton about that, and I think my approach, I think, kind of resolves that, right? And it creates, it's an approach to resolving the logical consistency by identifying, a causal graph of people's reasoning structure.
And the canonical debate would do that, right?
I don't. Okay, first, I don't see how your approach aggregates because that's not in the paper. So I don't.
Oh no, not in that paper, but the distributed.
That's in a different one. That's in the
Yeah, you can. I linked to that at the very end of that article. I should also do it on the sidebar. But if you want, I can stick the article in here. Let's see.
Meta-reasoner and logic of distributed Bayesian reasoning. Yeah, I did read that part also. I think I'll reread it and see how it solves that because I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, I think that article needs some work on clarity, but read this introduction article that I just posted into the chat.
Okay.
And that's kind of the states the goal of aggregating people's judgment, sort of a hypothetical opinion poll of what people would believe in a logically consistent way if everybody shared all information.
Okay, I'll think of it in terms of the distributed deliberative dilemma, because now I remember the terms of that.
Yeah.
And it's a real issue, of course.
Yeah. And there's a whole field that kind of launched of judgment aggregation. There's a lot of papers on judgment aggregation and impossibility results. And some interesting things.
Yeah, a bit Arrow's theorem type things. Yeah.
Right, kind of analogous, to Arrow's theorem, but in fact, someone even unified social choice theory with judgment aggregation in another paper, and basically generalized Arrow's theorems, I think, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't expect the global belief to be consistent, right? Why would it be given that people are not piecewise consistent internally? And even assuming they are, they're certainly not consistent pair to pair. So why should the aggregate be consistent? My only goal is to expose the inconsistency and to trace them to their roots. And as you said, identify the missing piece of information. There I'm with you. That is important. And that is easy to aggregate. Again, it's just about seeing what sways the most people. It's a very simple function.
Well, so I think that if you have individual consistency and rationality, it depends on how you aggregate. The problem with the deliberative dilemma is you're aggregating by just taking a majority, right? 2 out of 3 people think A, then they aggregate thinks A, right? You just need to change your model.
I agree.
And you actually, now what you say is, what I say is there's a meta-reasoner, and the meta-reasoner thinks that the probability is 2/3 that A is true. And then you have conditional probabilities, and once you have a causal graph, then you have a beliefs of a meta-reasoner that are totally consistent as a Bayesian reasoner.
And assuming that the causal graph is shared, right?
Exactly. Yep. And so
and consistent, which
right.
which I think is total counterfactual in the real world.
Well, so what you can, a causal graph says there's an arrow every time there's a direct causal link, and basically, what's interesting about the causal graph is where there's a lack of errors. Because if there's a lack of errors, you're saying there is no direct causal link, right?
Yep.
Once you find evidence of a direct causal link, you got to have an arrow, right? And and so kind of my thinking right now is, you can, if you observe a direct influence, then you have to draw an arrow, right? And if you don't have evidence of a causal inference, you can leave the arrow out. That's something I need to develop further.
You're aware that most causal links are circular and it's not an acyclic graph. And it makes things complicated.
Right. Yep.
But yes, still, I think you're right that there's a lot of agreed upon causal graph, and identifying the controversial arrows is absolutely for me a goal. So that way I think we share it. That's a goal we share. Distinguishing which arrows are wide consensual versus controversial,
yep,
versus fringe. So that's good. That's absolutely worth doing. And understanding what are the arguments that get people to change their belief about an arrow is absolutely valuable. And that's good because it gets us out of the logic quagmire in a way. And for me, because as I said, a story, a metaphor has no logical link and can still sway someone. And the ability to sway is not about logical connection. And that's what I'm saying. In a way, it gets us out of the logic quagmire, which is good in this case. The question is only, is this relevant to changing people's beliefs?
Yep. And that still helps me answer the question, what would people believe if they shared all the same information, right? The information is just a totally emotional appeal. And you might say, well, that's not logical. We don't want to take that into consideration, but we do. Because I want, personally,
like 10-year-old needing an abortion is an emotional appeal.
Right. And the thing is, if people would think differently, were they exposed to this appeal, you want to know that, right? And you don't want to withhold information, like in a court case. If you might say, oh, well, let's not let this person testify because it'll be an emotional appeal. But I say, no, you got to let that person testify and let the jury, take this all into consideration. Well, anyways, a little off topic, but I should probably head out soon.
No, thanks a lot.
Yeah, I gotta get going too. Yeah, thanks. Keep sending your work. I hope someday we can have like a really constructive discussion on scoring.
Well, I'm getting
with our model
close to having
I think we just had one.
At least.
No, true is constructive, yes.
But I haven't yet coded it, but I'm getting close to having what I think is an algorithm, right? That
excellent.
That you could actually implement. And Bentley, a while ago now, he said, look, once you have an algorithm, let me throw some data in it and see, because his model is close enough, right, that it can take his data and see what my algorithm comes up with. So I look forward to doing that.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
See you Monday, maybe.
Have a good weekend.
Right.
Yeah.
You too.
Ciao,
Bye.
ciao.